So, I'm about 20 years late, but better late than never. After hearing for years how good F.E.A.R is, I finally decided to give it a proper shot. For some background, I remember this game coming out and seeing the commercials, but at the time I was around 15 and simply missed out on it. Not because I wasn't interested, but because I ended up getting other games during the holiday season instead. I remember hearing people talk about F.E.A.R and kind of dismissing it, thinking it wasn't something I absolutely had to play. That might have been because I was deep into Resistance Fall of Man, where I spent countless hours playing online. By the time I was ready to ask my parents for another new game, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare had came out in 2007. Once I got that, I never really looked back or felt the need to pick up another first-person shooter, which was another reason F.E.A.R slipped through the cracks for me. There was also the fact that Max Payne has always been one of my favorite games. At the time, I kind of assumed F.E.A.R was just piggybacking off that style, borrowing the slow motion and gunplay, and that it probably wouldn't be as good. I was wrong. Now, years later, I'm glad I finally got to experience it the way I did, playing it today on an Xbox Series X, where it looks absolutely stunning. I've also been in a phase lately where I'm going back and playing games I missed out on growing up, and F.E.A.R felt like a big one I needed to finally check off the list. So the question is, what do I think about F.E.A.R now, looking at it through a 2026 lens, while also trying to put myself back in the shoes of who I was in 2005 and judging it on that merit as well. Spoiler alert, I loved it, but it isn't perfect. Before getting into it, a quick disclaimer. I'll touch on the story a bit and how it's told mostly through gunplay and atmosphere, but this won't be a deep dive into the plot details or characters. This is much more about my experience with the gameplay and my thoughts as someone playing F.E.A.R for the first time. With that out of the way, let's get started. F.E.A.R makes a strong first impression by being incredibly easy to pick up and play. The controls and mechanics are simple and intuitive, to the point where the game doesn't even bother with a traditional tutorial. And it doesn't need one. Everything feels immediately readable and responsive, allowing you to focus on the experience instead of learning systems. Key mechanics are introduced in a way that feel completely natural. The slow motion feature is self-explanatory, tied to a clear meter that depletes as you use it and regenerates when you stop. There's no confusion, no interrupting, and no hand holding. The flashlight works the same way. You're given it early for darker sections, and it has a visible timer, and you always understand its limitations without needing an explanation. One surprise was discovering that the game allows you to aim down the sight. Going into it, I was surprised to find this out because most games predating Call of Duty 4 did not have this. Even more surprising is the ability to peek around corners, something I personally associate with Rainbow Six Siege, a game I spent countless hours with. Combined with my experience playing Call of Duty, these mechanics made F.E.A.R feel immediately familiar and comfortable despite its age. The game also makes a bold and ultimately smart choice by not including a sprint button. At first, I kept trying to sprint and assumed the lack of it would bother me. Instead, I quickly stopped noticing altogether. The default movement speed feels deliberate and well balanced, keeping encounters tense without feeling sluggish. The core idea behind F.E.A.R, a horror-focused first-person shooter, is genuinely inspired and something that should be far more common. First-person perspective is perfectly suited for horror because of how well it places you directly inside the experience. Everything feels personal, invasive, and uncomfortably close. The approach would later be embraced by Resident Evil 7, and it makes sense considering the franchise was originally intended to be a first-person shooter. F.E.A.R demonstrates exactly why that perspective works so well for horror. There's no emotional distance, no safe camera angle, and no buffer between you and what's happening. One of F.E.A.R's greatest strengths is how alive its environments feel. Nearly everything reacts to your presence, producing sound and movement that deepens the immersion. Water splashes, glass shatters, footsteps echo, radio chatter, ambient noises hums in the background, and even rats contribute to the atmosphere. This holds true even when you're simply moving through a space, and once combat starts, it becomes a full-blown sensory experience. The game is awesome to play with headphones on or with a good sound system. Sound cues are constant and meaningful, whether it's distant replica chatter or subtle environmental audio that tells you what's coming before you see it. The sound effects themselves are incredibly satisfying, while the music blends seamlessly into the soundscape instead of overpowering it. Environmental storytelling is another major highlight. Throughout the game, you'll find landline phones with voicemails that provide background on the story or feature people desperately trying to contact whoever was there before. Combined with the abundance of dead bodies and gruesome scenes, it creates the feeling of walking through an aftermath of disaster, like moving through a horror movie after everything has already gone wrong. One standout moment perfectly captures how strong the atmosphere can be. After replicas cut the power, I entered a room that was completely pitch black. When the firefight began, the muzzle flashes from the gunfight briefly lit up the space in sharp bursts of color and motion. It reminded me of a scene from The Batman, one of the coolest uses of lighting I've seen in a movie. And little did I know, F.E.A.R had done it over 15 years earlier. The shooting in F.E.A.R is incredibly visceral and satisfying. Bullets feel powerful, impacts are brutal, and every encounter feels dynamic. The physics and animations, both in slow motion and at normal speed, are in a league of their own and genuinely had to be seen to be believed. Debris and particles fly everywhere during combat, explosions look outstanding, and grenade detonations create visually striking impact bubbles that feel almost Matrix-like. The game even goes further by including flying limbs and extreme gore, ensuring that no two kills ever look the same. Blood, bodies, and environmental destruction linger, and sometimes you even have to backtrack through the mess you created, reminding you of everything you've just survived. Another cool detail I didn't catch until much later is that you can actually shoot grenades out in the air. I really wish I had known this earlier because I would have been doing it the entire game, but it never crossed my mind to try since I've never played another game that lets you do this. Discovering it so late almost made me think that maybe a small tutorial wouldn't have been such a bad idea after all. But at the same time, I still appreciate how the game lets you go out and experiment on your own terms and learn things naturally. Slow motion deserves special mention. F.E.A.R does it better than any game I've ever played, and yes, that includes Max Payne, which I don't say lightly since it's one of my favorite games of all time. Despite how flashy and action heavy the combat is, F.E.A.R never treats horror as a gimmick. This is a horror game first and foremost, with a confident tone and a story it clearly wants to tell. The fact that the game would have been fun even without the horror elements makes the inclusion feel deliberate rather than forced. There's a clear sense that the developers care deeply about the experience they were creating. Every detail feels intentional, reinforcing the idea that this wasn't just meant to be another shooter, but something more unsettling and memorable. Enemy behavior is one of F.E.A.R's most impressive achievements, particularly when it comes to the standard soldiers, known in the games as replicas. Their AI is smart, reactive, and genuinely unpredictable. Replicas retreat when they're close to dying, not to run away but for reposition. They communicate constantly, calling out your location, reacting to your flashlight, panicking when you tear through their squad, and coordinating with each other. Sometimes replicas disappear entirely, only to reemerge from the shadows and ambush you later. They knock over furniture to use as cover, limp when you shoot them in the leg, melee you when you rush them, and hunt you down if you leave one alive. You can't treat them like disposable cannon fodder. They behave like opponents who are actively trying to kill you. The game also does a great job mixing things up with heavier enemy types. There are enemies in heavy armor suits that can absorb lots of bullets before going down, forcing you to be more deliberate with your shots and positioning. On top of that, the game introduces large mech suits that are even more powerful and can fire rockets, dramatically raising the stakes of encounters. While these two enemy types operate at different difficulty levels, both are fun to fight and add meaningful variety. On top of that, the game introduces more supernatural, Psycho Mantis is the best way I can describe it, like enemies. And these ended up being some of my favorite enemies to fight. They're genuinely creepy, visually striking, and force you to switch up your playstyle instead of relying on the same tactics you used against the replicas, armored enemies, or mech suits. Gameplay is so flexible that I sometimes literally quit and reload just to replay encounters in different ways. Seeing how different situations can unfold depending on how you approach a fight really highlights how much freedom the system and level designs allow. The guns in F.E.A.R are some of the best I ever had the chance to use in a game, and outside of slow motion, they're the main reason I consider this a must play for fans of first person shooters. Every weapon feels powerful, distinct, and incredibly satisfying to fire. One of my favorites was the Penetrator. This is a bit embarrassing to admit, but I actually didn't realize until after my playthrough that it's a gun that fires massive nails. In hindsight, that explains the unique sounds it makes when firing, and why enemies will sometimes end up pinned to walls. Something I had never seen in a game before. At the time, I was so immersed in the shooting and visuals that I didn't even question it, but learning that afterwards made the moments click instantly. I love the weapon regardless, and it wouldn't be the last time I realized there was mechanics I had overlooked during my first run. Another standout was the particle weapon, which was an absolute blast to use. This gun fires a straight energy beam that completely disintegrates enemies down to the bone, creating some incredible visuals and making it a perfect one-shot kill option. My favorite weapon overall has to be the Vulcan Canyon. Instead of traditional bullets, it unleashes a powerful shockwave that sends enemies flying or completely destroys anything that it hits, including walls. Seeing enemies get launched backwards and taking in the damage it leaves behind is incredibly satisfying. The best way I can describe it is a shotgun on steroids focused on force rather than pellets. The rocket launcher is also a lot of fun to use and really comes in handy when dealing with the giant mech suits towards the end of the game. It fires multiple rockets at once, which adds to the overall power trip that fits perfectly with the rest of the game. Speaking of shotguns, the shotgun here is excellent and easily one of the better ones in the genre. The standard submachine guns, assault rifles, and other conventional weapons also get the job done. I won't go into detail on those simply because the standout weapons left a much bigger impression, but the overall arsenal is consistently strong. I also learned after the fact that the dual submachine guns were an Xbox exclusive feature, which makes me especially glad that this is the version I played. That setup ended up being one of my most used loadouts. The variety of weapons keep combat fresh from start to finish. Each gun feels distinct and looks incredible in motion, especially during slow motion sequences. Ammo management is fair but important. You'll occasionally run low, but finding ammo isn't difficult if you pay attention and loot fallen replicas instead of relying solely on pickups. Health packs initially seem generous, but you quickly realize why they're necessary. Replicas are accurate, aggressive, and capable of draining your health faster than you expect. For most of the game, level design is another strong point. Maps are open and semi-linear, with multiple paths vertically and branching routes. Exploration is encouraged, often rewarding you with ammo, health, or slow motion boosts. However, this strength collapses in the final third of the game. The clear audio and visual guidance that worked so well earlier largely disappears. I spent long stretches running in circles with little to no indication of where to go. Progress often came down to trial and error rather than understanding the environment. Combat remains flexible, allowing you to play at a distance or rush replicas up close and personal. My preferred style, even though it's risky. Slow motion isn't mandatory, but it's highly recommended given the replica's accuracy and grenade lethality. One generally strong moment of variety comes from the occasional use of ceiling mounted machine guns, letting you mow down groups of replicas from a safe distance. Unfortunately, towards the end, the cracks slowly begin to show. Some maps overstay their welcome, enemy counts become exhausting, and pacing shifts from tension building to grinding. The final part of F.E.A.R is some of the worst gaming I've experienced. After already dealing with frustrating enemy types, the game introduces floating, spiral drones, and later ghost-like enemies that kill you in just a few hits, artificially jacking up the difficulty and draining the fun. Combined with prolonged navigation confusion and movement slowing nightmare sequences, the experience becomes exhausting. The ending offers no real payoff, only an abrupt cliffhanger. That said, I would still go back to F.E.A.R, just not to finish it again. Replaying the first two thirds, experimenting with mechanics I missed, and approaching encounters differently now that I know the system better is something I genuinely enjoy. The contrast between how brilliant F.E.A.R begins and how badly it ends remains baffling. A game full of incredible ideas undercut by a final act that works against everything that came before it. So, did I enjoy F.E.A.R overall and would I recommend it to players today? Absolutely. Not only does it hold up, but I would honestly argue that it's still one of the best shooting gameplays in any first-person shooters to this day. The graphics and art style are about as good as it gets, and I think even younger players who didn't grow up in this era would agree. That's not just nostalgia talking. The only real critique some might have is that the character models and facial animations haven't aged particularly well, but when you're in the middle of a firefight, it barely matters. On top of that, the art direction and lighting more than make up for any shortcomings, and you really have to be looking for flaws or be especially picky for it to bother you. The sound design, controls, physics, weapons, AI, and atmosphere are things you generally have to experience for yourself to fully appreciate how well they all come together. And interestingly, the aspects of the game that show their age aren't always negative. F.E.A.R comes from an era where ragdoll physics were heavily emphasized, and games leaned into edgy, stylish, moment-to-moment gameplay inspired by movies like The Matrix and, in this case, The Ring. On paper, that combination shouldn't work, but it absolutely does here because the developers knew what they were doing. I'll be the first to admit I'm a sucker for 2000s games and also old school design, but I genuinely believe that players of all ages who enjoy first person shooters or video games in general, will find something to love and fear. Whether you play it for a few hours or see it through from start to finish, there's something here that feels truly special.